Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center, welcome to our webinar on funding and financing strategies for integrated hazard mitigation and water resource plans. My name is Kristen Crew from the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. Before we begin, we're going to go over a few logistics and then we can get started. During this webinar today, everyone will be kept on mute to ensure audio quality. If you have a question, please type it into the GoToWebinar question dialog box anytime throughout the session. We will be saving your questions for a facilitated Q&A session at the end of the presentation. After the webinar, you will receive a follow-up email that includes a link to the recording and other information that you may need. You can also download the slides from today in the Handouts tab in your GoToWebinar control panel. This webinar has not been submitted for pre-approval of continuing education credits, but eligible attendees will receive a certificate of attendance for their personal record. To receive a certificate for this session, you must attend for the entire session and register and attend individually using your real name and unique email address. Certificates will be sent via email within 30 days of the webinar date. If you have questions or need assistance, please contact Small Systems at syr.edu. Now for a little bit about us. The Environmental Finance Center Network provides training and technical assistance to small water and wastewater systems in all U.S. states and territories through our Building Technical, Managerial, and Finance Capacity programs. If your community or utility needs assistance with drinking water or wastewater system management, please feel free to contact us through our request form, which I will be sharing shortly in the chat. And on that note, we can get started. I would like to introduce our presenter for today, Natalia Sanchez, a program manager from the University of Maryland Environmental Finance Center. And Natalia, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Kristen. Give me just a second here to get my screen squared away for you. All right, can you see the slides?
Not yet.
Okay.
All right, I can see them.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you again, Kristen, and thank you all for attending this webinar, Funding and Financing Strategies for Integrated Hazard Mitigation and Water Resource Plans. This webinar is intended to show how local decision makers can pay for integrated hazard mitigation and water resource projects. Whether you manage a small water system, act as your local mitigation planner, or direct a large regional district, the basic principles and strategies discussed in this webinar can address your community's funding needs in order to move from planning to implementation. My goal is to introduce you to funding and financing strategies that are likely to apply to most jurisdictions, big or small, and to provide examples of how communities have adopted these strategies to protect source water, mitigate flooding, and tackle a number of other local issues. So what exactly is integrated hazard mitigation and water resource planning, and why is it beneficial? Integrated planning is an approach to planning that provides a comprehensive view of resources and commitments to ensure financial and capital resources are aligned with community priorities. As opposed to a fragmented planning process, which is typical in most communities, integrated planning incorporates elements that are common to multiple planning objectives, in this case, hazard mitigation and water management, to align common elements and identify mutual or overlapping activities. Integrated hazard mitigation and water resource planning comes with a number of community co-benefits. It helps to reduce confusion and redundancies in community priorities, creates a broader range of support since it draws on a larger set of community goals. It reduces hazard impacts and addresses water quality mandates, and it increases overall community resilience. Integrated planning also has significant economic benefits. Because the plans and strategies are integrated, it helps to streamline resource allocation and coordinates available project funding to accomplish more than one goal. It allows communities to leverage different funding sources that may not have been considered for a single benefit program and increase access to financing options. For example, you might be able to tap into a local source water protection grant and federal hazard mitigation technical assistance programs to implement the same project because you have defined the issue as both a water quality and a mitigation challenge in your integrated plan. It allows you to scale water and hazard mitigation projects to facilitate access to additional resources, attract large-scale investors, and potentially shift from funding to financing. And some utilities are even integrating plans with neighboring communities and partners in the area in order to achieve larger scale. Regional climate collaboratives are a great example of this strategy. So to address the problems of increasing extreme weather events, communities across the country have started to work together at a regional scale to put in place coordinated policies across multiple jurisdictions. By moving beyond fragmented planning and development programs, communities can achieve integrated solutions to address climate change while overcoming limited resources and technical capacity needs. So I already mentioned most communities generally use a generally somewhat fragmented planning process that only looks at one general issue at a time. For example, you look at stormwater or drinking water or community resilience independently. While there are many models for planning, they all typically break down into 5 major steps. First, you identify issues and existing conditions. Second, you describe your needs and state your planning goals. Third, you collect data and evaluate potential strategies. Fourth, you develop your plan and recommend solutions. And fifth, you adopt the plans after some community comment period. It is not until after a plan is adopted that we think about implementation, including timelines for strategy adoption, project financing, and monitoring and evaluation. That means whenever we talk about project financing and budgeting, it's after we have already undergone the typical planning process. This often leaves us chasing the money. It is a very common problem. We undergo an elaborate planning process, we have well thought out strategies, but then we cannot implement our solutions because we haven't thought through the various funding and financing sources. As communities across the country face increasing costs associated with maintaining safe and clean water, preparing for increased extreme weather events, and managing failing infrastructure systems, we will need to mobilize support and resources around plans that can address these growing concerns comprehensively. Rather than maintaining the typical planning process where a community develops the plan first and then considers implementation and costs after the fact, it is important that we shift the discussion about financing and funding earlier on in the planning process. This can help us integrate community goals, leverage project funds, and reduce overall implementation costs. Incorporating funding and financing strategies into integrated planning efforts will enable communities to successfully implement projects, build resilience, and respond to potential threats while maximizing efficiency. If your community has already assessed your climate risks and vulnerabilities and developed an integrated hazard mitigation and water management plan, the information in this webinar can help you identify opportunities to pay for those proposed strategies. However, if your community has not yet completed an integrated hazard mitigation and water management plan, the information in this presentation can inform your plan development process and enable you to consider what types of funding and financing strategies you may want to integrate early on. So I'm going to break down the steps for or the process for integrating funding and financing earlier on in the planning process into 3 steps. The first step is you will want to identify general costs as part of the data collection process and develop estimated budgets. Insufficient funding and the lack of strategic financing is often a barrier to implementing projects. However, once your community has identified specific hazard and water resource concerns and developed potential interventions to address these concerns, You can determine cost estimates of specific actions and overlapping strategies. To do this, you want to identify overlapping strategies and interventions. You want to consider the different types of costs for each planned intervention, including capital costs such as equipment and land acquisition, labor costs such as new and existing staffing, contractors or other service providers, and operations and maintenance costs such as software you use for asset management or supplies or equipment maintenance. You then want to develop a comprehensive budget for the first year, as well as a long-term budget projection to include inflation and additional contingencies. The next step is going to be to conduct a basic benefit cost analysis, or BCA, to thoroughly evaluate potential strategies and prior to proposing solutions. Funding will likely depend on the benefits or avoided losses that your community can demonstrate. Understanding the expected outcomes of your integrated hazard mitigation and water resource strategies can help your community prioritize projects with the greatest impact and focus your plan on the implementation of high impact practices. You want to assess the qualitative and quantitative benefits of proposed implementation strategies. This includes reviewing historical loss records, any national case studies, or other available sources that are available to you. You want to include up-to-date climate change projections to accurately account for future risks mitigated by the proposed implementation strategies. And you want to attempt to monetize typically unquantified social and environmental benefits. You also want to consider potential federal guidelines for benefit valuation. For example, FEMA benefits are mainly the avoided losses of the National Flood Insurance insured properties, which are easily quantified, and they have very specific guidelines for benefit valuations to generate a numeric BCA value. However, other funding sources, such as EPA grants and loans, do not use the formal numeric benefit cost analysis, but have more qualitative requirements for assessing project benefits. Compare the future benefits of the proposed projects to the implementation costs. If this benefit cost analysis is greater than 1, the likelihood of securing funding is improved. If the BCA is less than 1, it may be advantageous to look at alternatives to increase benefits. If possible, you want to consider doing a total cost benefit analysis that attempts to monetize typically unquantified social and environmental costs and benefits, and that estimate costs and benefits over the lifetime of an asset rather than over a specified period of time. The last step is you want to develop a basic funding strategy and incorporate it into the plan. It is important to identify a wide set of funding and financing mechanisms and determine how to best combine them to cover costs and allow you to prioritize options. A well-defined funding strategy may be required by specific funding sources, and even if it is not required, developing a detailed funding strategy will help match projects with the appropriate funding sources and ensure efficient implementation of the integrated hazard mitigation and water resource plan. You want to avoid limiting your options too soon. Consider cost-saving approaches, revenue streams, and innovative strategies. See what is out there and think about a blended portfolio approach that combines multiple sources of funding and financing options to cover the costs. You also want to understand how funding sources can or cannot be combined. For example, some federal grants are not to be combined with other federal grants to fund a single project. And there are restrictions on what can be used on matching funds. So matching funds that are required by many grants may be difficult for small communities to obtain, preventing them from applying for these grants and loans. Understand the alternatives available to your community for cost share under the Code of Federal Regulations and be aware of requirements such as documentation for the match. You want to identify available clearinghouses for your state's grants and loans, and you want to identify and develop a strategy to fill in any major funding gaps that you have identified going through this process. It's also important to understand what funding and finance options are available to your community. So Funding are financial resources that do not require repayment. So think general fund, taxes, fees, and grants. Financing is the acquisition of money for a program or project that does require repayment of principal and interest. So things like loans and bonds. To develop a sustainable financing and funding strategy, you will want to consider your desired activities and associated budget needs, existing sources of funding or in-kind support, and your community's appetite for new revenue programs. In the rest of this webinar, I'm going to highlight key financing and funding strategies and examples from communities that are successfully utilizing these approaches to implement projects. The mechanisms I'm going to break down into two categories. The first category is the cost reducers. Cost reduction strategies increase a program's efficiency and reduce its overall costs. While not explicitly a source of funding, these approaches help stretch public funds and leverage outside resources. Next, I'll cover revenue streams, and these are the mechanisms that actually generate and access capital for project implementation. Keep in mind, while you may be familiar with several of the common financing approaches, this webinar is intended to build a basic understanding of the various strategies so that you can, one, incorporate financing considerations into earlier stages of the planning process, and two, combine and leverage strategy strengths that can help reinforce the implementation of comprehensive plans. Assembling the appropriate mix of cost reduction and funding strategies is highly dependent on a community's particular needs and characteristics. Again, cost reduction strategies can increase effectiveness and reduce spending. It is important to think comprehensively and creatively, as well as to incorporate multiple objectives and long-term needs when looking for mechanisms to reduce costs. Some cost reducers may require a larger initial investment of time and resources, but it is important to incorporate that long-term savings into the plan. So the first cost reduction strategy that I'll go over is probably one that everyone on the webinar is familiar with: comprehensive plans. Comprehensive plans address growth, land use needs, and the increasing impacts posed by water resource management and extreme natural events can help reduce costs. Comprehensive plans are the mother of all integrated plans and therefore share many of the community and financial benefits discussed earlier in the webinar. Namely, they clarify priorities, establish commitments, recommend integrated strategies, provide a single point of stakeholder engagement rather than requiring this for each project alone, and facilitates coordination amongst departments. Local governments can use this planning process to explicitly address their hazard mitigation and water resource needs. By incorporating such challenges into the local comprehensive plan, solutions can then be incorporated into integrated long-term plans, which will increase cost effectiveness and save unnecessary expenses in future years. Two examples of comprehensive planning are in the states of Washington and Maryland, both of which have a long record of requiring additional integrated elements into their plans. In 1990, Washington State established the Growth Management Act, which required each city and county within the state to prepare a comprehensive plan that regulates development, conserves natural areas, and guides economic growth by designating critical areas for protection and including frequently flooded areas, geologically hazardous areas, and critical aquifer recharge areas. Maryland's smart growth legislation enacted in 1997 focused on incentives rather than regulation by targeting state funding to encourage growth and investment in existing urbanized areas while encouraging the preservation of rural legacy areas. Smart growth aims to limit sprawl and reduces impervious surface and pollution from runoff, which helps stormwater systems and water quality. The next cost reducer I'll talk about are capital improvement programs. A capital improvement program identifies and prioritizes a community's needs for publicly financed physical infrastructure. By coordinating investment projects across multiple priorities, capital improvement programs or CIPs can help reduce redundancies and increase efficiencies. So for many of you on the webinar, how many of you are involved in the CIP process? And if you are, do you try to adopt a dig once approach and take into consideration the risks of natural hazards? If you do, then you can lower the cost of project implementation and ensure your investments are more secure over time. For those of you who may not be familiar with the term dig once, it refers to actively incorporating additional benefits to pre-scheduled infrastructure projects. For example, if your community is expected to undergo road maintenance where the ground will need to be excavated, then this presents an opportunity to integrate green infrastructure to address stormwater runoff, to change out old drinking water infrastructure, or even possibly to lay down new broadband lines. This approach of piggybacking additional benefits on an existing project allows you to leverage existing funding, leads to greater efficiency and overall cost benefits. Municipalities should develop a capital improvement plan evaluation criteria that prioritizes projects that address hazard mitigation and water quality concerns to ensure that these considerations are embedded in all future projects. Two examples of communities using this approach are Prince George's County in Maryland and the state of Vermont. Prince George's County amended its county code in 2012 with a new ordinance that incorporates green streets and pedestrian safety under the planning for roads and sidewalks. The state of Vermont established its hazard mitigation plan in 2018, which is implemented by collaborative efforts among different state agencies. Among other measures identified in the plan, municipal planning and capital improvements incorporate the use of a river corridor tool and road infrastructure tool designed to identify sites that are most vulnerable to flood damage in this planning process. Next up are cooperative procurement and interlocal resource sharing. Cooperative procurement and interlocal resource sharing are tools that local governments can use to reduce time, administrative overhead, and other costs. Cooperative purchasing combines the requirements of two or more entities to leverage the benefits of volume purchases, delivery and supply chain advantages, and the reduction of administrative time and expenses. Cooperatives can pool demand for a product or a service in order to get lower prices from suppliers. For example, several local governments in a watershed could work collectively to hire a contractor to design bioretention areas and benefit from a better negotiating position. Interlocal service agreements are where the participants agree to share service responsibility or contract with a neighboring government to provide the service to the other jurisdiction. An example of interlocal resource sharing is when several smaller municipalities purchase one snowplow, which is shared. Similar to cooperative purchasing, interlocal service agreements can increase economies of scale and help to provide high service levels, optimization of facilities, and increased accountability. An example from Minnesota is the Minnesota Watersheds Districts, which have provided cost share funding to cities, counties, and other entities for stormwater management practices. The Minnesota City Stormwater Coalition was formed to help cities manage their requirements under the federal MS4 permit laws, rather than have each city hire a consultant of its own. Next, I'll talk about public-private partnerships. While many people think of public-private partnerships as a financing mechanism, they're actually a cost reducer. The value of a public-private partnership is the ability to bundle together the design, build, financing, operations, and maintenance of an infrastructure asset in the most cost-effective way, in a more cost-effective way than the public sector can do it. A well-structured P3 will have both partners sharing the risks and rewards of the implemented projects. The local government usually maintains ownership over the asset, and the private company is responsible for one or more aspects of project implementation. The private company receives from the local government a regularly scheduled concessions payment, usually funded by a toll, a user fee, a rate payment, or tax revenue. Municipalities are attracted to P3s because they can defer upfront costs, and investors are attracted to P3s because of the high level of transparency, investment premiums, and secured repayment streams. In addition to the traditional P3s, local jurisdictions may also want to explore community-based public-private partnerships, which go beyond the basic requirements of a P3 to include the alignment of goals, accountability, transparency, and sustainability. Community-based P3s are thus uniquely positioned to address environmental and community-based challenges. An example is in 2012, Prince George's County in Maryland created the Clean Water Partnership as a community-based public-private partnership program to meet regulatory requirements by leveraging private sector resources and promoting operational efficiencies and innovation in design, construction, and maintenance. The county needed to retrofit 15,000 acres of impervious surface area in order to comply with the Clean Water Act regulations, but was also interested in investing into communities and building a local workforce capable of maintaining green infrastructure. The public-private partnership relies on funding from a stormwater utility. The county provides the oversight, and Corvia Solutions manages the infrastructure investments, providing ways to streamline costs and improve the efficiency of the investments. Next up are rebates and tax credits. Rebates and tax credits provide incentives for communities and private property owners to make investments or adopt certain best management practices that benefit the community. By helping people to get part of their money back in the form of rebates and tax relief of various kinds, local governments can make it easier for residents to spend money on or to contribute to environmental projects, both reducing the costs to the jurisdiction and increasing the impacts for the community. Projects implemented on private properties can complement those on public lands and reduce the need for larger public investments. More and more recently, municipalities have developed rebate programs to incentivize the implementation of water conservation and stormwater management practices. For example, the Borough of Westchester in Pennsylvania implemented a stream restoration fee in 2016 to partially fund its stormwater management system and comply with regulatory permit requirements. The initial fee is directly proportional to the total impervious area of the parcel, and discounts of up to 60% of the fee are applied for those that implement green infrastructure practices. Anne Arundel County in Maryland has both a stormwater remediation fee and a stormwater property tax to pay for stormwater management practices. Property owners receive credits towards both if they implement practices on their properties to control stormwater runoff. And at the federal national level, the Community Rating System, CRS, of FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program, rewards communities that undertake floodplain and watershed management activities that exceed the minimum floodplain management requirements of the NFIP. Residents obtain increased discounts on their flood insurance premiums based on the increased amount of hazard mitigation activities that they implement. The final cost reducer that I'll talk about today is regulations and policies. Policies can be adopted by local jurisdictions to formalize the community's hazard mitigation and water management goals, reduce the capital costs of implementing integrated hazard mitigation plans, and encourage private sector investment in the community. Updating codes, instituting Dig Once policies, and streamlining permitting processes can help advance a community's goals without significant investment of public dollars. And they can even provide a funding stream in the form of enforcement fines, mitigation payments, and fee and in lieu of payments. Incorporating updated standards and having local codes that require or allow developers to minimize impervious cover, conserve natural areas, and use runoff reduction practices to manage stormwater runoff can help reduce construction costs, leverage private investment for implementing projects with a public benefit, and ensure more resilient communities. An example of these regulations and policies come from Montgomery County in Maryland. In 2014, both the tree canopy law and the county's roadside tree protection law went into effect. Both laws established sediment control permit requirements, which require limiting disturbance by planting trees or paying fee in lieu into a dedicated account. As of fiscal year 2021, mitigation fees paid because of the law totaled approximately $4.6 million. These fees are dedicated funds for purchasing, installing, and establishing shade trees to enhance shade and canopy, including on private property, multifamily, and homeowner association properties, businesses, and schools. The county staffs Tree Montgomery, and the Tree Montgomery staff meets with eligible property owners to select the species and locations for the trees. A contractor then completes all the planting work, and Tree Montgomery staff inspect each tree after planting. By the end of fiscal year 2021, Tree Montgomery had planted more than 5,800 shade trees. And then next up, I will talk about revenue streams, which again are mechanisms to actually generate and access capital for project implementation. In general, local jurisdictions rely on two methods for funding or financing infrastructure: a pay-as-you-go or a pay-as-you-use. A local jurisdiction's size, geography, land use, legal framework, coverage of government services, and citizens' preferences can all influence its revenue structure. First, I'll talk about general funds. We should all be pretty familiar with these. These are typically the main source of income for municipal governments and generally come from property income and sales taxes. Competing local priorities make it difficult to rely on general funds, leading to unstable resource allocation in many cases. In addition, hazard mitigation and water management costs have been increasing at a higher pace than general funds, and relying exclusively on these will most likely prove insufficient. More reliable tax funding may include selective sales taxes, such as those levied on the sale of commodities and services, special assessment taxes, which are local level taxes imposed on residents to fund an infrastructure project that will improve the community, tax increment financing district, in which the costs of improvements are paid back by future tax increases, or special improvement districts, in which members of the group are assessed fees to pay for a desired benefit, including green spaces and trees. As we all know, in general, taxes are unpopular and, given the current economic climate, are unlikely to garner public buy-in. An example of a tax used for water plans is from Fairfax County in Virginia. More stringent regulatory requirements and essential reinvestment in the county's aging infrastructure resulted in the need to establish a funding mechanism that was independent of the general fund. So in 2010, they implemented their stormwater tax, which is currently assessed at a value of 3.25 cents per $100 of assessed real estate value. Another revenue stream are fees, which differ from taxes in that they are assessed in order to recover some of the cost of providing a service to a beneficiary, rather than simply raising revenue for general funds or disincentivizing undesired activities. Using dedicated fees is preferable because it avoids competing with other programs and needs that compete for general funds. Local governments can levy fees for a variety of reasons. Ideally, to be better accepted, fees should be linked directly to the cost of providing the service and used exclusively for that service, as well as applied uniformly and fairly to all beneficiaries. One example of a fee is a permit fee, which is assessed by local governments to raise revenue directly from any proposed development or construction that may worsen stormwater impacts. There are also drinking water utility fees, which are a common example of a utility fee. The challenging part of utility fees is establishing a price that covers utility costs while still maintaining equity. There are also impact fees, which are traditionally one-time charges to developers used to pay for improvements to services and amenities necessary to serve new development. These fees have the potential to take into consideration projected environmental impacts due to development and can be used in part to mitigate such impacts, for example, by incorporating green infrastructure. And then there are fee in lieu fees, which is a fee that a developer or other person or entity must pay to compensate for the environmental impact a development project may have. A couple examples of fees. One is from Northampton, Massachusetts, which established a stormwater and flood control utility in 2014. For this new funding stream, instead of calculating the fee based on the amount of impervious surface for each property, the average runoff for a single family, 2-family, and 3-family homes were determined, and fees were based on those averages. In Missouri, stream restoration projects are funded with mitigation requirements for developers that impact streams. Mitigation may include paying into a fee in lieu, which is sometimes used for stormwater management programs. So next I'll be talking about bonds and loans. Debt, either through bonds or loans, is another source of capital for local jurisdictions. Bonds and loans are debt financing used to borrow money to finance a specific project and spread the repayment over time. There are differing attitudes whether you should use a pay-as-you-use strategy, issuing debt and paying off the debt over the project's lifetime, because debt increases the total cost of the asset through the interest payments. But it also allows you to save time and build capital projects sooner by borrowing upfront and spreading out payments over a long time to smooth out expenses and create a more predictable cash flow. Some examples of bonds are green bonds or climate bonds, whose proceeds are earmarked specifically for green projects and can be issued as general revenue bonds and are backed by the taxing authority of the community or a state. There are also environmental impact bonds, which are another instrument for financing large projects that pay returns based on outcomes. They are a form of pay for success debt financing. In other words, investors can only collect a return on their investment if the project proves to be successful. They have an additional performance payment made to investors if projects achieve greater than expected performance. A couple examples of bonds and loans are in April of 2019, the California Infrastructure and Economic Development Bank, known as the iBank, issued $83.9 million in green bonds for the Drinking Water State Revolving Loan Fund program. The program provides low-cost financing for planning, design, construction, and implementation of critical drinking water infrastructure improvements necessary to mitigate drinking water risks to human health throughout the state. Also in 2019, the Virginia Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund program provided $20 million in funding for the Cumberland Forest Project. The Virginia Department of Environmental Quality, which houses the state's Clean Water Revolving Loan Fund program, partnered with the Virginia Department of Forestry and the Nature Conservancy to purchase and permanently protect 22,856 acres in Southwest Virginia. This is the largest open space easement ever recorded in the state. Grants are non-repayable funds which are dispersed or gifted by one party to another and are usually used to fund specific programs or projects. The process of winning a grant can be quite competitive and time-consuming and usually requires writing proposals, following strict specific guidelines, and which are then evaluated by the funding agency. Funds for grants can come from both the public and private sectors. In this slide, what I'm showing is a table from the Environmental and Energy Study Institute's fact sheet on federal resources for nature-based solutions to climate change. When you get the handout, or if you look at the handout, it is hyperlinked in that bottom link there, and I highly recommend you check out this resource. This fact sheet provides a survey of federal funding and technical assistance available to help local governments and agencies, tribes, non-governmental organizations, universities, and individuals implement nature-based solutions for climate resilience. Many of these resources of federal support allow communities to develop projects which draw on the multiple interrelated benefits of nature-based solutions. This fact sheet also identifies the types and attributes of projects the programs support. Another form of philanthropic revenue is crowdfunding. In recent years, crowdfunding has made an appearance to raise cash for programs that focus on the common good. Campaigns are typically launched for projects that don't require a substantial amount of funds, typically aiming to raise anywhere between $5,000 and $30,000. The chief advantage of crowdfunding is raising awareness and public support for projects, but funds can also be used as match for larger grants. An example of crowdfunding is IOBE. IOBE.org is a crowdfunding platform that helps connect local leaders with support and funding from their communities. This is being used by Sustainable Connecticut, which is a voluntary certification program that supports and recognizes thriving and resilient Connecticut municipalities. And the Sustainable Connecticut program is partnering with IOBE to offer a community match fund as a flexible funding mechanism for sustainable projects in the state. Last up, I'm going to talk about offsite credit programs or mitigation banking as a revenue stream. Although technically it kind of sits on its own, it's its own separate thing. Mitigation banking compensates for ecological loss resulting from offsite development activities. Following the completion of the project, credits are generated and then purchased by permittees to compensate for the impacts associated with projects in their sites. A mitigation bank can be created by a government agency, corporation, or nonprofit organization, and mitigation projects can be sited on public or private lands. Following the mitigation banking system, some states and local governments have begun to develop off-site stormwater crediting programs as alternative mechanisms to implement on-site stormwater management practices. Local governments and water districts can invest in green infrastructure projects that provide stormwater management services and generate mitigation credits. These approaches can facilitate sustainable stormwater control projects, increasing capacity to capture, treat, and reuse stormwater, enhancing flood control functions, or achieve other kinds of public objectives. So it's kind of like a fee in lieu system, except rather than payments being put into a fund, they're going into purchasing a mitigation strategy in a different location. Some examples of this include in Minneapolis, the Capital Region Watershed District allows companies to purchase and sell credits for ongoing projects, especially related to green infrastructure. The crediting system is designed for areas where it is difficult for new development to implement stormwater systems, like in developed downtowns. This credits banking system fits here because most of the district is fully developed. Developers there can purchase credits that contribute to projects in other locations. In less developed areas, companies can volunteer new green infrastructure that reduces their own municipal stormwater fees and is paid for in part with the credits purchased through the Capital Region Watershed District. So with the remaining of my time, I'm going to go through a few case studies where jurisdictions have used multiple sources of both cost reducers and revenue generators to finance projects in their communities. So blended finance simply refers to the idea of combining multiple finance and funding sources. Having a diverse funding portfolio can help ensure the implementation of projects. The first case study I want to share is from Charlotte, North Carolina. In the city, housing and commercial districts were built in floodplains, and they had experienced repeated flooding losses. So the Mecklenburg County Stormwater Services Division started to buy and tear down these properties that were most vulnerable to flooding. To date, the county has used $67 million in federal and local money to buy more than 400 residential and commercial lots in flood-prone areas. The county has been working to restore these floodplains and incorporated them into its greenway system. Between 2008 and 2011, they purchased and tore down the high-risk apartments, restored the floodplain and stream channels, and constructed water quality enhancements. The project area is now known as the Chantilly Ecological Sanctuary, comprised of 24 acres and home to thriving ecosystems. So as you can see here, they utilize a number of different funding sources, including federal and state grants, utility fees, and fee in lieu of funds. The city and the county utility fees are paid by the fee payers based on impervious area on their property. Their city's post-construction stormwater ordinances established a mitigation fee to be paid by developers who utilize the option to pay for in lieu of providing on-site stormwater management. The next case story I will share with you is from Dubuque, Iowa. Residences of the B Branch watershed in Dubuque, Iowa were found to be especially vulnerable to flooding. This watershed area includes the city's most developed areas where over 50% of Dubuque residents either live or work. The watershed encompasses historic neighborhoods offering some of the community's most affordable workforce housing. In 11 years, the area had been hit by 5 flash floods, and 1,150 homes and businesses were identified as especially vulnerable to severe flooding. By 2003, a citizen advisory committee was set up to determine the best solution for the watershed, and they decided to create an open channel solution and hire a consulting firm to design the project. The restoration was planned for in 2 phases. The lower B Branch section was completed in 2011, and it includes a large expanse of open water that wraps around a formal industrial site, which is now redeveloped into a retail center. The upper B Branch Creek restoration project was completed in 2017 and is designed to take on stormwater during rain events and move it safely through the area without flooding adjacent properties. It features nearly 2,000 foot long creek and floodplain, a multi-use trail system, a play area, scenic overlooks, gardens, and an outdoor amphitheater. So how did they pay for all of this? The project's total costs are $219 million. As of fiscal year 2020, the city had received $161 million in funding to help fund and finance the project, including $52.1 million of federal and state funds, $98.5 million in the form of state sales tax increment financing spread over 20 years. And additionally, the Clean Water State Revolving Funds Sponsored Projects Program, oops, that's a mouthful, was used to construct more than 70 green alleyways in the B Branch watershed. Finally, private donations of $165,000 were raised through America's River 3 campaign to plant trees and build amenities along the watershed. Increments in the city's stormwater utility fees are contributing to fund additional costs of the project. A statewide example that I wanted to share is from Vermont. It's hazard mitigation statewide effort. This came about following Tropical Storm Irene's destructive path through the state in 2011. That is when the state's emergency management department became proactive in managing natural hazards. The state not only started a buyout effort to purchase flood damaged and flood vulnerable properties in 2012, but more recently also started a mitigation initiative that addresses vulnerability in a more comprehensive way by restoring streams and floodplains. Floodplain restoration conserves critical areas and watershed functions so water can be spread out to low-lying areas after heavy rainfall events, which benefits not only the natural system, but also reduces the vulnerability of buildings and infrastructure that would otherwise be in harm's way. The priority actions were established in the 2019 Vermont State Hazard Mitigation Plan by a steering committee comprised of multiple stakeholders across state agencies and nonprofit organizations. Since 2012, the state has been able to acquire and demolish close to 160 flood vulnerable properties and complete approximately 70 infrastructure projects. FEMA has funded about 75% of these buyouts, and the rest has come from different federal and state programs. And the breakout goes a bit like this. So in terms of cost reducers, there are municipal bylaws to prevent development in flood-prone areas, alleviating the need for future buyouts. They are leveraging land where the flood vulnerable or flood damaged structure used to be located for conservation. And they also developed a website for the state called Flood Ready, which provides information and resources for communities to plan and implement mitigation projects, including information on funding sources. And that is available at floodready.vermont.gov if you wanted to check it out. In terms of revenue streams, federal and state programs, including FEMA, the Vermont Housing Conservation Board, Vermont's Ecosystem Restoration Grant Program, and more were leveraged. They also established an Emergency Relief and Assistance Fund. It's an incentive program to determine the state-based match for municipalities following a declared disaster to repair public infrastructure and to reward communities that have taken mitigation measures. So communities are eligible to receive as much as 17.5% of the costs from the state if they have taken significant flood mitigation measures. My last example is from the SLIGO Creek watershed in Montgomery County. For those of you who don't know, Montgomery County is the most populous county in the state and a suburb of Washington, D.C. The SLIGO Creek subwatershed encompasses 11.1 square miles of highly developed land. SLIGO Creek is one of 14 tributaries of the Anacostia River, which flows into the Potomac River and is one of the major tributaries of the Chesapeake Bay. The Anacostia River is one of the most urbanized and polluted rivers in the country, and became the focus of large-scale restoration efforts in the 1980s. SLIGO Creek's watershed has been dramatically modified by high-density commercial and residential areas and developed before today's environmental standards for stream valley protection and stormwater management. And uncontrolled stormwater was eroding stream banks. In 2000, a study of the health of SLIGO Creek declared it biologically impaired after only 4 species of fish, all tolerant to high levels of pollution, were present in the creek. So to solve this issue and restore stream health, efforts were initiated to control urban runoff and restore habitat along the stream. The efforts began in 1989 and continue to this day. The creek restoration has also been part of joint regional efforts, including to restore the Anacostia watershed undertaken by Montgomery County, the Maryland Department of the Environment, National Parks and Planning Commission, the Washington Metropolitan Council of Governments, Army Corps of Engineers, EPA, and many more. The regional efforts were completed in 5 different phases between 1989 and 2007, included improving existing detention wet ponds and constructing new ones, restoring forests, restoring streams and wetland habitats, installing low-impact developments for stormwater management, implementing vegetated controlled practices, and reintroducing native fish. These practices have led to a 41% reduction in peak flow discharge in the upper watershed, improvements in water quality and in the stream bed and bank stability, improvements in stream habitat, and the recovery of macroinvertebrate fish populations with 14 species of fish present currently. Restoration of SLIGO Creek continues, and Montgomery County has implemented multiple projects through both its Department of Parks and its Department of Environmental Protection. So to pay for this, the restoration efforts were completed in 5 separate phases, and it totaled approximately $3 million in costs, excluding monitoring costs. This included $1.8 million from Montgomery County's capital budget, $1 million from MDE's Small Creeks and Estuaries Reserve Cost Share Program, and $256,000 from the Army Corps of Engineers. So if you're still with me, thank you so much. In conclusion, in this webinar, I discussed the benefits of integrated hazard mitigation and water resource planning. I articulated the difference between financing and funding, outlined a number of different cost reducers and revenue streams, and explored examples of how those strategies have been effectively used to pay for project implementation in communities across the country. There is no simple or single solution to funding and financing municipalities' efforts to address water resource management problems and to reduce the risk of natural hazards. But by looking at these problems in a holistic way and integrating plans, communities can potentially reduce their costs of dealing with these challenges and increase the chances of accessing new sources of funding. Remember, early on in the planning process, to look for ways that reduce costs, explore opportunities to work with adjacent municipalities, and potentially bring in the private sector to provide services in a more efficient way. Remember to remain flexible and assess a variety of funding and financing sources to determine which ones may be accessible and worth implementing, given the realities of your particular municipality. Work to identify potential sources of revenue early on in the planning process and understand if there are ways to combine multiple sources. Lastly, prioritize projects in order of urgency and funding potential in order to jumpstart hazard mitigation efforts and get communities working in the right direction towards solving your water management and hazard mitigation challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. And I'd like to open up the next couple of minutes for anyone that would like to ask questions. Just go ahead and type it in the question box and I will make sure that the question is asked.
Kristen, you're muted, so if you're asking any questions, I'm not hearing you.
There are not any questions yet.
Okay, great.
I'll give everyone just one more minute. All right. I have a comment. Great ideas. Thank you.
Thank you.
And to wrap this up, a huge thanks to you, Natalia, for sharing your expertise with us today. Following this webinar, you will each receive a follow-up email with the slides from today, as well as a link to the recording. We ask that you complete the webinar evaluation following this webinar so you can let us know your thoughts on today's session, as this helps us plan future webinars on topics that are important to you. Thank you again, and we hope to see you at future EFCN events.
Thank you, Kristen.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too.